Hi, I'm DJ Ware. On this episode of the Cyber Gizmo, I'm going to be looking at Thunderbolt and Proxmox, trying to get them both to work. Right after this. What I want to talk about today is Thunderbolt itself first. I think there's a lot of confusion around what it is, what it does. I mean, I've heard all kinds of reasons for not using it. So well, let me just drop back a second and talk about what it is. First of all, I'm trying to accomplish. Spend a few minutes talking about what it does, and then how to make Proxmox work with it as well. So that's the three things I want to do today. So I have a ZFS pool I want to migrate. It's currently running on Ubuntu 2104. The ZFS version number is 2.02. And I want to move this over to a Proxmox server that is currently running Proxmox version 7. And of course, that's Debian 11 as the host operating system. So my Proxmox server is installed on an Intel NUC 10. The Ubuntu server is a Intel NUC 6. Yeah, a 6. So it's like the old Skull Canyon one. So yeah, so I want to move that over. And the Intel NUC 10 doesn't have any internal drive base. So some of them have like one SATA drive, and some of them, all of them have at least one NVMe drive. Some of them have two. But in my case, mine only has a single NVMe drive support. There isn't a second one, and there isn't a SATA port either. It's not one of the tall NUCs. So the Intel 10, however, does have a single Thunderbolt 3 port that I can use. I think Intel NUC 11s have Thunderbolt 4, and we'll talk about what some of those version differences are. So the current pool is installed on a Thunderbolt 2. Yeah, I know, it's old. It's a disk array. And of course, the Intel NUC Skull Canyon is a Thunderbolt 3 as well. So yeah, Thunderbolt 3 has been around a while. But this storage array has been around since way even before that. So yeah, it's a Thunderbolt 2. So the best I'm going to be able to get out of this is 10 gigabits per second as in overall throughput. That's 20 gigabits total, but Thunderbolt 2 divides it into 10 gigabits receive, 10 gigabits transmit. So yeah, anyway. So the drives that I have installed in there are SATA, and they are Hitachi 8 terabyte drives. So yeah, it would be kind of expensive to migrate this over. So some of my options are I could go out and buy a Synology NAS. The NAS is about $500 USD. Then I would probably need a 10 gig card for it. I would need a 10 gig port on my router. And yeah, so that's an expensive solution. And I don't really want to go that way. I don't want to really spend any money. I prefer to just use what I got. So I could convert an old server to run TrueNAS Scale. Unfortunately, Scale is still in beta. So that means I would have to drop Clearback to run in TrueNAS Core, which is BSD based. And I came from BSD. I don't want to go back. So yeah. I could move Proxmox over to a new server that has built-in SATA ports. However, that usually is not advisable. And so I probably would end up having to buy a host bus adapter, an HBA adapter that has, most of them are SAS, but you can plug SATA drives into SAS. They will work. Electrically, they will work. So whether or not the firmware supports it or not is a different story. But yeah, I mean, electrically, you can plug a SATA drive into a SAS port. It will work. So, but again, it's up to the firmware to say, oh, yeah, I can read that drive or not. So that's really not, I mean, I already have Proxmox set up. I'm pretty happy with it being on the NUC for my needs. It fills my needs fine. So I don't really want to build a server. I could enable Thunderbolt and unplug the drive array from the Ubuntu server and plug it into the Proxmox NUC 10. Now, there's more to it than that, and we'll cover that today. But to me, that the analysis on this one seems obvious. I mean, if everything else is going to cause work and money, then let's do the what's obvious, and that in this case is just unplug the drive from the Ubuntu NUC and plug it into the Proxmox NUC and see if it'll come up. See, now I have never tried to run ZFS on Debian before. This is the first time for me. So should be the same. It should be the same, should work exactly the same as Ubuntu, but never know. Could be some differences in the software versions. But I will keep the other ideas in mind in case this fails. Before we actually get into this and we actually do this work, let me go back and explain to you what Thunderbolt is. So Intel demonstrated something called LightPeak back in 2009 at the Intel Developers Forum, or the IDF. And they showed that running on a prototype Apple Macintosh Pro. That was the old cheese grater. And I think that was the first implementation of the Intel chipset on the Mac Pro, because prior to that, they were all PowerPC. So obviously that wouldn't have been much of a demonstration for Intel. So yeah, but they didn't really do anything with it for a couple of years. I mean, they worked with Apple in collaboration to develop Thunderbolt. So a lot of people say, oh, this is an Apple product. No, Intel developed this, but they collaborated with Apple to give Apple what they needed for the Macintosh. So yeah, if you think this is solely an Apple product, no, it's solely an Intel product that Apple helped work on. So there are currently 4 versions of Thunderbolt today. There's Thunderbolt 1 that's still out there. It's a 10 gigabits per second standard. There's Thunderbolt 2, and that jumps it to 20 gigabits per second in total. And then there's Thunderbolt 3, and that goes to 40 gigabits per second. Now, I think on Thunderbolt 3, the total aggregate is 80 gigabits per second. What they're quoting here is actually the send and receive, not the, it isn't, the 40 is already halved, so it's actually running at 80 gigabits per second. A lot of people say it's 40, and that's not true. Thunderbolt 4 actually still does everything that Thunderbolt 3 does. So it runs at a total aggregate of 80, but then each send and receive lane is 40 gigabits per second. There are some differences, however, in Thunderbolt 4, and we'll cover those. But a lot of people just say, well, Intel didn't really do anything. But the one thing you need to keep in mind here is that Intel designed Thunderbolt to work up to 100 gigabits per second. So according to them, they should be able to, at least on paper, be able to reach 100 gigabits per second with Thunderbolt, and then they'll probably have to look for some new technology. Now, originally, LightPeak was slated to come out on fiber optic, but after they started experimenting with copper, they discovered that it worked quite well, and in fact, it worked well enough that, and because it, implementing something on copper is a heck of a lot cheaper than it is on fiber. Because you don't need to have all the LECs and all the workings that have to multiplex and demultiplex light channels into electronic signals that a computer can understand. We do not have optical computers yet in order to do that, so we do have to do some conversion of the signaling. The second thing that at the time, fiber optic wasn't able to carry power. Now, that's not true today. Fiber optic can certainly carry power. Corning demonstrated it a couple of years back using, I think it's infrared that they use to actually, and then they convert it to voltage on the other side. But anyway, the fiber optic can carry voltages today. So that is no longer true. So you hear somebody say, oh, don't use fiber optic because it can't carry power. That's not true. You can. As far as what additional things that have in it, Thunderbolt 1 and 2 also used a mini DisplayPort connector, and some people were kind of mad when Intel switched it to the USB standard, but originally Intel wanted to be on the USB standard, but the USB forum, which controls the standard, said, we don't want to do any of this mixing stuff on our standard. No, we're just not interested in doing that. Well, apparently, after 2 releases of Thunderbolt, they finally convinced the USB forum that this is really not a stupid idea. It's a good idea. And so they switched to USB 3. in order to do this. So apparently Intel did convince them to do it. But yeah. So what does Thunderbolt really do? I mean, what is it? How does it? Well, we'll talk a little bit about how it works. But first of all, it allows for connection of video monitors, disk drives, Ethernet devices. You can even attach other Thunderbolt hosts. And when you connect another host over the Ethernet, it creates an internalized Ethernet controller. That an Ethernet controller can run, depending upon what version of Thunderbolt you have, can run up to 40 gigabits per second. So, yeah, and there is a Linux kernel driver that does support that, and I believe the supplier for that kernel driver is Apple. So if you're wondering how Apple contributes to the Linux kernel, there is one of the ways that they do it. I don't believe that comes from Intel. But I have tested it. I have gotten it to work, but I had some other stuff attached to the chain, and the other stuff didn't like the Ethernet being up, but it did work. I did get an Ethernet drive. I was able to communicate back and forth over SSH. It gave me an IP port because I had configured them as static, and then was able to communicate to the other host. But the drive array that was on there just dropped off. So yeah, I don't think it's really meant to be run with additional devices on there since it wants to use the entire bandwidth. So, yeah. Whether or not you can control that, I don't know. I didn't get that deep into it. I just wanted to try it for just to see if I could get a 40 gigabit per second connection over a Thunderbolt wire. And yeah, it does work. Um, and we talked about Thunderbolt running over copper and fiber optic. You can connect up to 6 devices per connection. So the old way is to daisy chain one Thunderbolt device to another. So you chain this device in to out to this device in and so on. Now, the NUC device only implements one connection, so it has to be obviously at the end of one chain. It doesn't have multiple chains to use, so you have a little bit of a disadvantage there. So yeah, you can connect it to the next device, but if the next device only has one Thunderbolt connection, you're done. So, but normally most of them have two, and then you can connect from that device to the next on the chain and so on down the line. The other way of doing it today is there are Thunderbolt hubs. So now I'm not talking about docks. I'm not talking about docking devices that are Thunderbolt. I'm talking about actual hubs where you can plug the Thunderbolt devices together on the hub and only use up one of your connections to do that. So what is it? What is Thunderbolt? What is it? How does it work? So Thunderbolt actually multiplexes one or more PCIe data lanes and DisplayPort devices for transmission across a single cable. So, and it uses 2 Thunderbolt lanes to do that. One, of course, is to send, and one is to receive. So that is the way it works. And then it demuxes. I think there's a total of 4 that's in there, 2 on each. So it demuxes those 2 lanes back into PCIe lanes at the receiving end. So yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of overhead, but a lot of people say, oh, there's a protocol that takes forever. And no, it isn't that slow. Now, there may be problems with the graphic cards implementation because most of those are going into devices where you plug a graphics card into an external device that has a PCIe bus, which then in turn is connected to a Thunderbolt. But was not the intention of Thunderbolt. Thunderbolt was meant to hook up monitors and that way. So itself, Thunderbolt is pretty simple. But if you want to plug in a DisplayPort device directly, you just plug in your mini DV port into the end of the chain on Thunderbolt 2. You just plug it into the end of the chain and you're done. I mean, that's all you do, and it'll work. So it will see it and it can display up to, I think, 4K on Thunderbolt 2. And I think there could be 2 devices, 2 4K monitors up on Thunderbolt 3 and 4. Might be more on 4, I'm not quite sure, but I think it is definitely 2 devices on Thunderbolt 3. So Thunderbolt also supports daisy chaining. We talked about that. So So what was the reason for developing Thunderbolt? Why did they bother to do this? So there was a desire to allow machines without PCIe support to connect and attach to external devices and operate at nearly the same speeds as a PCIe device. That would be laptops, that would be small form function devices like the NUC, using a single cable. So they just wanted to make this simple for people at home and also for corporate environments that are maintaining workstations that need to have the ability to connect to multiple devices on their desktops. Some people need more storage. I know that some of the guys that I work with, particularly some of the database admins, wanted to keep full versions of the database running someplace where they could then test and load and try new versions of the software to see what effect it would have once that was rolled into production. That could be patches, that could be anything like that. It could be even changes to the database itself. It's always good to try it out first and see if you're going to break something. But anyway, it allows multiple devices to be attached to one string, and it allows multiple hosts to be connected together to form a high-speed network. But like I said, I tried this. Don't have other things on it in a daisy chain. So Thunderbolt 3 versus Thunderbolt 4. So in 2017, originally you had to pay a royalty payment to Intel in order to use Thunderbolt to implement it. And so they required that in order to enable it. Now, Thunderbolt is actually a part of the chip architecture today, but there are still motherboard manufacturers that implement their own add-on boards in order to provide support from the motherboard. So, yeah, I mean, you don't, anyway, they removed that requirement in 2017. You no longer have to pay them royalty payments for using Thunderbolt. That was to try to increase its use. Intel, however, still requires that they do the Thunderbolt certification for any devices which say they are quote unquote Thunderbolt enabled or Thunderbolt ready. So yeah, they still do that. Since Intel, and this is what happens when you have corporations that are competing in the same space with one another. Intel doesn't manufacture AMD's chipsets, and so therefore they don't do the certification for AMD devices. However, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Thunderbolt 3 began to see more laptops and also these low form factor devices coming with Thunderbolt on them. And that started in around 2018. Thunderbolt 4 adds the capability to protect Thunderbolt from evil maid attacks by protecting the data memory and etc. from PCI DMA vulnerabilities. So that was added to Thunderbolt 4. That's one of its major things. And then back to the AMD saga. So Wendell Wilson over at Level 1 Tech demonstrated getting Thunderbolt 3 support on AMD Threadripper. And I remember that video well, using a Titan Bridge Thunderbolt add-on card. And he did it by modifying the firmware. Basically, he was proving that, hey, this hasn't got anything to do with hardware. This is just firmware getting in the way of preventing us from getting this to work on AMD. Well, we also have support that Apple now has added to Thunderbolt for their ARM-based M1 chips. So we know that Thunderbolt will run over there as well. And currently that's Thunderbolt 4 on the M1 side of things. So Thunderbolt 4 is compatible with Thunderbolt 3. Thunderbolt 3 is compatible with Thunderbolt 2 and 1. I suppose that means by inference that Thunderbolt 4 is also compatible with Thunderbolt 2 and 1, but I have not tried it. So I do not know. I mean, that would make sense that if it's compatible with 3 and 3 is compatible with 2 and 1, then ergo 4 should also be compatible with it. But you are giving up your trading speed. So your bus is going to run at the speed of the slowest device. It's just like anything else, right? So yeah, you're not going to be able to maintain a 40 gigabit per second connection if you start plugging Thunderbolt 2 devices into it. That will drop down to 20 gigabits aggregate and 10 gigabits for your send and receive, as you will see when we get over here to talk about it. So what are some of the vulnerabilities of Thunderbolt? This is what it currently is known. So vulnerability to DMA attacks, that's Thunderbolt 3, 1 and 3. It is vulnerable to option ROM attacks, and of course that would be, we consider that a supply side attack because somebody gets a whole, Thunderbolt, when it comes up, it executes the ROM on the device that's connected to it, which makes sense, right? I mean, you'd have to bootstrap the device from its own ROM, and so it executes that code. And if a evil supplier puts malware into their boot ROM, well, that's going to get installed in your machine. So yeah, that it is vulnerable to a supply side attack. It is also vulnerable to data exposure attacks through ThunderSpy, which allow access to memory and data and all this stuff. Even if your machine is in a locked state, password protected locked state, data can still be read because the PCIe bus is still available. It's still open. It's still running. So yeah, but the thing is, all of these vulnerabilities require some form of physical access to the hardware devices. Yeah, if I had a DMA attack, I would have to plug my device into the Thunderbolt string. If I have an option ROM attack, I would have to plug my device with the infected boot proms into the drive array. Now, it's possible that you might buy a device that has malware on it. But again, that goes down to trying to make sure that you certify your devices before you put them online. And the other one is data exposure attacks. Again, that requires physical access to be able to do that. So yeah, you can't just get at that from over the web. So what am I going to do? What am I trying to do here? I'm trying to put this on Proxmox and move it over. If you want to follow along, here's all you got to do. In your BIOS for your Thunderbolt device, you'll have an option. I can't tell you where that option is because everybody's BIOS is different. But you will have an option that allows it to enable Thunderbolt support. You will need to do that. And that will allow your machine to have the support built into it and bring up the appropriate modules in Linux, for example, that are needed in order to interface with the Thunderbolt device. Second, you'll need to install Bolt. Bolt is a package on Debian and Ubuntu that contains the Bolt control software, which is used to authorize the devices. You can also list them. You can remove them. You can block them. Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff you can do with them using that tool. So it's a nice check to have. Once you have the device plugged in and turned on, as far as Proxmox is concerned, it will automatically initialize the ROM on that drive controller, and it will read the drives in and attach them to the Linux kernel as devices. Now it's up to you to decide how you want to use those devices. If you can use them as individual drive arrays, you could use them as individual drives. You could put ZFS on it, which I already had on there. And so I just want to take that and import it over to Proxmox if it'll work. So it should, because the ZFS version is also 2.02 over on that side. So yeah, hopefully that will work. So I want to import or create a ZFS pool. And importing it, you may have to use the -F option because there are some checks as to whether or not this happened on the same machine or not. So yeah, you might have to force it to actually do the mount, but that's the import, I should say, but that's minor. Then you'll want to add the ZFS pool to the storage menu and supply it with the types of files types that you want to support on that pool. Like you could split your VMs from your containers, or you can put them all together on one pool. It's up to you. But that currently is the only two types of storage types that Proxmox supports on ZFS right now. So I hope at some point they expand that in the future and offer additional ones. I mean, it would be nice to be able to maybe have ISO templates. It might be nice to have my backups there, although I don't really need my backups on ZFS. I have other ways of doing that anyway. So I use my cluster to do that. And it's fine. It works fine for that. But for your needs, you may want to expand that pool's capabilities at somewhere along the line in the future. And you're kind of limited by those two types, virtual machines or containers. So you can install Proxmox on top of ZFS and make it the root file system. There are instructions on the website to do that. So if you're bringing up your Proxmox from scratch and you want to take this ZFS pool and have Proxmox create a root pool on it and then install itself, you can do that. And then, of course, you can always break out additional pools on that data set as well. So, yeah, not a big deal. As far as how to validate whether or not your device is being recognized, you'll need to do a bolt control, a bolt CTL as root on your Proxmox server. You'll have to do this from the command line. There is not currently a GUI for Thunderbolt control except not in Proxmox, but there is a GUI support under Ubuntu running GNOME, and I think probably some of the other utilities as well. Some of the other desktop interfaces as well work with it. So you'll see here that it's identifying itself as a peripheral up here. And you'll also notice that it's an Aikido Thunder 2 quad. So Aikido was bought out by OWC. And yeah, that is an original Aikido device. And then this has now become part of OWC. So that brand is no longer around. So it is an OWC device now. Generation Thunderbolt 2, it is authorized. It will show you the domain. I don't care if you see this because I'm blowing this thing away anyway. But yeah, the 20 gigabits per second and the text speed and so forth and the flags. So, oops. When it was authorized was the 13th of September. When it was connected, the 13th. And of course, that was today. And then the last time, the policy IMMU and so forth. I noticed that the Thunderbolt controller shows up in the pass-through. So it is possible, I think, to pass this through to another device, but I haven't tried that. And of course, passing through a Thunderbolt, you're passing through all the devices. So yeah, you're not being able to just split this up and say, just send the disk drive over there. That would be nice. All right. So just to review, make sure your BIOS has Thunderbolt enabled. Install Bolt. Check to see if you have the devices showing up with LS block. Import or create your ZFS pool. Add the ZFS pool to the storage menu. And then you should be good to go. You can start using it. You can use the pools that are on it already and all of the data sets as well. Or you can destroy it and you can start over with it and make up all new ones. So, yeah. So I guess let's go try this out. And I'll show you what I have done. Always like to prove what I'm saying. So you don't think I'm making anything up. So I will be right back. I'm up here on Proxmox, and let's go down and drop down into the shell. And the first thing I'll show you is the bolt control. And you'll notice that I have my speed and my lanes and all that stuff, and it is authorized. And so we're all good here. The next thing we'll do is do an LS block and make sure that the drives are showing up, and they are indeed. They're right here. There should be 4 of them, B, C, D, E. And then we can status it, and we'll see that, yeah, these are HGST. They are 8 terabyte. And you can do whatever else you wanted to do here. So we'll just do a zpool list, and that should show. So I've got my pool, and it's about 29 terabyte in size, 254 meg in use. So not being heavily used at the moment. So the next thing we will want to do is go over and look at a storage view. And then you should see there's my storage pool for, so you'll need to create a new pool, and then you associate it, of course, with, your particular, your particular system. And then I have a container here that holds my container volumes. This one holds my VM disks. So you can create it right here, and that will allow you to do that, to actually bring in your pools. so that you can then start working with it. And then of course your containers you can define as well. Now if you want to do this from the command line, I think it's that storage config right there. So it's an Etsy PBE, Paul Victor Edward. And then you'll see that my two pools are down here. There's the ZBM pool, the mount point for that, and then the mount point for the ZBS pool. And of course, I can see my mount points right here. So yeah, there's the VM. I also have one for data, but I'm not currently using this one yet. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping they come back with a new one. So yeah, currently those are the only ones the GUI allows you to create. So yeah, and that if you want instructions on how to do that, they're in the manual. I'm not going to go through that today. This isn't a tutorial on how to operate with ZFS on Proxmox. I'm just trying to get a Proxmox pool imported over to the system. Now you can do the import down from the command line. So yeah, and then it will show up. It will show up here in your in this view. It will show up here. It'll show up like that. So once you've imported it, and then of course you can then build these out however you want. So yeah, with that, that's all I had today. I'm not trying to make this difficult. I was surprised that it worked actually, and it's not that I didn't think it would. Some of the problem, there are some problems with ZFS on I don't know if it's Thunderbolt related or if it's ZFS related. I get messages in the log that says that the drives did not attach. So I think that's a problem with shutdown when it brings Thunderbolt down. It happens when I reboot the machine. If I shut it down or if I restart, sometimes it will leave, I think, something hanging in the command structure of Thunderbolt. And so, yeah, and the drives will not come up. The only way to fix that is to shut down the Proxmox server, power down the device, the drive array, and then let it spin down, then power it back up, and then power up the machine, and that seems to clear it. So, yeah, it happens sometimes on Linux, and I think I'm pretty sure it's a bug. It's just a matter of me going and digging a bit, so I'll probably go do that. But I have had that happen a couple of times, and I want to tell you that so that if you run into it, you know what to do to fix it. I hope you enjoyed this today. And if you did, please like and subscribe, and hope to see you all again very soon. And bye for now.